like a lot of you in this room, I am a historian by training and by trade. And as I was trying to decide what to say in introducing our luncheon keynoter, Bob McIntosh, I was reminded by a colleague of just how much we historians depend on and owe to archivists. I'm sure most of us have had the delight of working with collections that are comprehensively organized, intelligently curated, and that are accompanied by useful finding aids and knowledgeable archivists. And with those things in place, our research goes a lot more smoothly, a lot more productively, and a lot more excitingly. And we owe that largely to dedicated professionals like Bob. And I want to tell you a little bit about his background. He's in the enviable position of viewing the historical research process from both sides of the table, as it were. He has been trained and has published in both the archival sciences and history. He was educated at the Universities of Alberta, Strasbourg, Carleton and Ottawa, and started his career at Library and Archives Canada back in 1992 as the archivist responsible for military records, and has gradually moved up the ranks ever since, to the point where he is now Director General of the Archives branch of LAC. He has published widely and to considerable acclaim. His article, The Great War, Archives and Modern Memory, won the Kaye Lamb Award in 1999. And he's also the author of the book, Boys in the Pit, Child Labour in Coal Mines, which was published by McGill-Queen's University Press in 2000. From 2004 to 2007, he was General Editor of Archivaria, which is the journal of the Canadian Association of Archivists. So he is someone with an extraordinary background in archival work, and one who appreciates what we do as historians and researchers. And it's really a delight to welcome him here to Toronto. Thank you, Bob.
And thank you all. I do feel somewhat distant from you. At some point during my presentation, I may be inclined to remove myself from behind the podium and walk your way, the threat being that not everybody would be able to hear me. Thank you all very much for being here, and it is a great pleasure to participate in the Association's sesquicentennial event. I'm here to speak to you this afternoon about sort of the wherewithal of business history, and that is the library and archival material that allows for business history to be written. You have the outline of my presentation there. I should be through it in half an hour. I do tend to digress and enter into anecdotes. I'll count on you to start signaling to me when I should get myself back on track. We're not going to have an archive if we don't have a documentary record, right? Our archives are absolutely dependent on the creation of a record. As we all know very well, for very, very good reasons, records aren't necessarily created. There are certain kinds of decisions or conversations that I would prefer be undertaken orally and never documented. And that's characteristic of the range of human activity. Even if a record is created, it doesn't necessarily persist, neglect, deliberate destruction. As we say in the archives business, 3 moves equals a fire in terms of the persistence of records. In the digital world, of course, this issue is compounded many times. Finally, of course, there's the issue in documentation of actually laying your hands on the record that interests you. A sound system of record keeping, as banal as it sounds, is absolutely critical to sort of the successful exploitation of any kind of documentary record. I work in a public archive. It's an institution to which the Canadian taxpayer contributes somewhere in the neighbourhood of $135 million annually. So we are an expensive organization. We face this basic issue or basic challenge as leaders at LAC, how most effectively to expend the public's money. That's very much a preoccupation of ours. How most effectively to expend this money to deliver on the mandate that Parliament has given to us. With respect to the issue of business history or business archives, of course, we can depict that issue in terms of yes or no to any potential acquisition. Acquisitions entail a range of expenses, everything from preservation work to storage to describing these records, making them available to researchers, potentially digitizing them. Any acquisition comes at a cost. We put a series of questions out before we undertake to make any potential acquisition. I don't need to read those questions to you. You can see them on the screen. Library and Archives Canada is actually a child of a marriage. 2004, the government of the day decided to amalgamate the National Library and the National Archives. It was seen as the most effective way, particularly in the context of the digital environment, the emerging digital environment, to address the issue of preserving and sharing Canada's documentary heritage. Documentary heritage was a term born in that piece of legislation. It basically means archival material and library material. What you see here is the text from the preamble to the legislation. It outlines sort of very, very broadly what LAC, Library and Archives Canada, is asked by Parliament to do. In any kind of bureaucratic environment, you take your legislation and you start to refine it or define it more and more closely to support decision-making, accountable decision-making. We make acquisitions in the context of a policy framework. There are a couple of elements to that framework to which I wanted to draw your attention. LAC defines its mandate very much in terms of records or organizations of national importance. If a given business, for example, were limited to a specific province, we would tend to push that institution or those records to a provincially based organization. The second element here, again, is closely linked to the first. Our aim, as much as possible, is to work collaboratively with other libraries and other archives. There are about, as I mentioned on a previous slide, or as you can see on a previous slide, there are about roughly 800 archives in the country, the vast majority of them being very, very small. There are about 3 or 4 times as many libraries in the country. There's an entire network in place, and if the network works as effectively as it should, I think we have a very, very rational way of ensuring that any potential collection or any publication finds an appropriate home. From a policy framework, we move to a strategy. The economy is very much an area of focus for LAC. We're particularly interested in economic activities that relate to research and technological development, but we're fairly Catholic in terms of how we interpret this this objective on our acquisition strategy. As you'll see in a few minutes when I describe to you a couple of recent acquisitions that we are literally bringing in as we speak this morning, or this afternoon rather. Three major arms to Library and Archives Canada, three major acquisition programs: the government program, the non-governmental or private archival program, the published program, the Old National Library program. Each of these three collecting areas has a role in documenting Canadian business. Library and Archives Canada, like most archives, national archives in the world, benefits by a clause in its legislation that reads, basically, no record created by the government may be destroyed without an explicit authorization from the Librarian and Archivist of Canada. What that clause does is compel federal institutions to come to us and seek permission before they dispose of any records for which they no longer have business value or value to the government institution in question. The Government of Canada is large. There are about 175 government institutions. It varies somewhat as new institutions are created or other institutions are amalgamated. It ranges in size from enormous institutions like the Department of National Defence to three-person shops like the Yukon Surface Lands Board. Many federal institutions, as you'll see in a moment or two, have a role in documenting Canadian business and entrepreneurship. The federal government creates millions of dollars, millions of records daily. Millions of records daily. So we cannot review every record before agreeing to any kind of destruction. We have an approach that basically aims at documenting key functions and activities of the federal government, certain interactions it undertakes with Canadians, but as succinctly as possible. As I've been speaking, there are probably 100,000 new records created by federal public servants across the country. We're talking about an enormous quantity of information. Basically, for the purposes of this presentation, we have grouped federal holdings relevant to business under 4 headings. I'll walk through them very quickly. I won't read what is on the slides, but I'll let the slides stand for a moment or two so you can have a look yourself. Of course, the federal institutions that look most like businesses are Crown corporations. Right? Probably not as many Crown corporations today as there have been historically, but there remain a fairly good number. CMHC, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. I think the other acronyms you will recognize very, very readily. The federal state, has a very, very important regulatory function. There are a range of records created by virtue of that function. You see certain examples here. You see an illustration from the 30s from the old Department of National Revenue, now CRA, Canada Revenue Agency. A third theme, in terms of federal holdings at Library and Archives Canada, records associated with economic development programs the federal government has sponsored over the years. Foreign investment promotion records, records related to, the old FIRA, the Foreign Investment Review Agency records, EDC, Export Development Canada, Canada Commercial Corporation, what have you. Ronnie, the Bren Gun Girl, is the illustration on this particular slide. The fourth and final area of federal jurisdiction relevant to business relates to the federal government's investigation function. There have been, I think we have 200 or 300 royal commissions or commissions of inquiry in our holdings. You have a sample of topics here that royal commissions have addressed over the years. record keeping in the Government of Canada is uneven. There are departments that are very, very good record keepers, and there are departments that aren't so good at record keeping. The good record keepers tend to be the central agencies and the security agencies. The less effective record keepers I won't name here. Because, of course, a readily identifiable archival record, an archival record that can be transferred to LAC, an archival record that we can readily make available to researchers, has to be, at its origin, sort of a well-managed record. So the moment record-keeping systems start to decline or deteriorate or become reduced to an individual public servant's desktop, the greater the challenge we have in actually identifying, preserving, and making the record available to you, the research community. The digital shift is very, very problematic in the Government of Canada, like in most institutions. The paper record is simply a reference copy or a convenience copy. The official record sits in a digital system of some kind or other. And LAC's great challenge at the moment is identifying, ingesting, and preserving and sharing with Canadians the digital record created by the Government of Canada, or by Government of Canada institutions. It's very much our focus today. I hope that within 2 years we can readily ingest digital records from GC institutions, and I would hope that within another 2 to 3 years we can make those digital records readily available to the research community. Very much a preoccupation at LAC at the moment is getting a grip on the digital record created by the Government of Canada. The private sector, as you'll know well, it's a very, very different kind of challenge for LAC. No private sector company is under any obligation whatsoever to do business with us. No obligation whatsoever. Having said that, over the years, and we've been in existence since about 1872, over the years we've assembled somewhere around 14,000 collections from private individuals, private organizations, private firms. We have a fairly extensive collection from the private sector. We've had a business program in place since the 1970s. We continue to acquire business records. Again, the focus is on businesses that had some kind of pan-Canadian influence or multi-provincial, pluriprovincial influence. We also tend to focus on business records that are at risk. If a healthy, fully functioning business comes to us to talk about acquiring or transferring to us the archival record, our first reaction would be to say, you should really be doing it yourselves. You should be doing it yourselves. It's with defunct business that we prefer to do our business. A few slides just to give you a sample of sort of the vast holdings that we have from the private sector. Again, I won't read everything that you see on the screen. They're more or less chronological. Fur traders. Of course, the Hudson's Bay Company archives, the archive of the analog record sits in Winnipeg. We simply have a very, very good collection of copies of the Hudson's Bay Company records. The forestry industry, some examples of collections that we've brought in. Steve Salmon, who's in the audience, probably had a hand in some of those. Financial institutions, we have a fairly good range of records from financial institutions. Now, having said that, in terms of businesses that maintain good corporate archives today, I think the banks are typically exemplary. Transport, communication, power, more examples. Mining, manufacturing, more examples. One of the most interesting new accruals that we are bringing in comes from the old Dominion Bridge Company. I'm going to give you two examples of new collections or new acquisitions. I rush to underline that these won't be ready for researchers for quite a number of months. We're literally in the process of going into the warehouses where they're currently found and doing preliminary inventories. But we're really quite excited about both of them. Of course, Dominion Bridge was a very, very significant engineering company, built most of the bridges associated with Canadian Pacific Railway, as well as bridges, some of the landmark bridges in some major Canadian cities. A really lovely, lovely collection. We got a small accrual, or an original accrual, from Dominion Bridge maybe 20 years ago or so. This is the balance of the records coming from the Dominion Bridge Company. One of the things that we try to do in making an acquisition, or an element that makes an acquisition sort of particularly attractive to us, is that if it aligns nicely with other records already in our holdings. And you can see a range of examples on this slide of other holdings at LAC that in some ways relate to the Dominion Bridge Company. The second new acquisition I thought I'd bring to your attention is called Orica. It's the old, at one time it was known as CIL. It started in the 1880s as the Dominion Cartridge Company. One of our PMs was its first president. After the Dominion Arsenal, it was the first private firm to be mandated by the government to manufacture munitions. Like many private acquisitions, this one originated with a phone call. An interested official at Orica thought these records might interest us. We got a phone call asking about our interest. And at the same time we were told, and by the way, we're getting out of that building in 3 months. If you don't want the records, they're gone. Which is very, very typical of private acquisitions, that a concerned individual from the firm gives us a call. Would you be interested? So it's a bit of a scramble. There's a very, very limited time frame. If we're not interested ourselves, but we think the collection is great, we will get on the phone to other archives to see if anybody would be willing to take the records. It's always a bit of a tragedy when you see a piece of Canada's history go. Okay. It was my good fortune to attend a session earlier this morning on women in Canadian business. If you look at the list of collections at LAC relating to really extraordinary business leaders in Canada over the last century or so, well, Hope Van Horn would go back to the 1880s, what is wrong with this list, or what is unusual about this list, right? Unless I'm misreading this, there's not a single female on this list. And this list, basically, I had the responsible archivist make a list for me of the most interesting collections we had relating to Canadian business leaders. This is the list I got. There are no women here. But having said that, of course, this is typical of the time, typical of the predominance of men in Canadian business as major Canadian entrepreneurs, a really extraordinary set of individuals, and a really, really extraordinary avenue into business history in Canada. You can also learn much about the history of Canadian business and Canadian entrepreneurship through labour records. So there's just a sampling of labour records that we have at Library and Archives Canada. And among the personal records of labour leaders, I guess 2 women are mentioned, Madeleine Perrin and Grace Hartman. Of course, another area where business history is documented is through publications. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on child labor in coal mines, mostly in Nova Scotia in the late 19th century. And it was an unlikely source from which I learned a great deal, the old transactions of the Canadian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy. Through that series of publications, and any researcher can learn a great deal about how mining was done at that time, how mines operated in Canada at that time. Like other national libraries, of course, we benefit by legal or through legal deposit regulations. If you publish in Canada, 2 copies by law are to come to Library and Archives Canada. Unfortunately, we've only had that power since about 1953, so the earlier published record is uneven, but nonetheless, it helps us to develop, I think, a very, very comprehensive record of at least contemporary publications. As I mentioned, much can be gleaned from publications. One of the issues we have in terms of sharing publications with the public, of course, is copyright. But earlier publications can be digitized and made available. We share with the public many of our earliest publications through working with an organization called Early. Well, it's a branch of Canadiana.org, and the particular program is called Early Canadiana Online. There you have the home page. Just a few ideas or thoughts in conclusion. People may or may not agree with the claims I make here. Certainly at LAC, our assumption is that business has a role in documenting its own history. Right? As I've mentioned, the only point at which we'd agree to take business records would be if effectively the business was going defunct. The records would otherwise be at risk. But we certainly operate on the hypothesis that a healthy business, especially a large business, should be in a position to document its own history. Many businesses do just that. I've spoken about the archival system. We have about 800 or so archives in this country, about 3,200, if I recall correctly, libraries. It's always a challenge as well as an opportunity sort of to work with partners to ensure that sort of the most rational decisions are taken. But certainly if you go down a list in order of priority of really, really interesting collections, that you, through working with the system, through working with colleagues, you can ensure that at least a major portion of those collections find an institution where these collections can be preserved. But working with that network is very much a preoccupation of ours. Does it always work as effectively as it should? You know, are those phone calls made when they should be made? I think that question can be debated. The third issue relates to access to business records. And it's tied in with that original offer that we may or may not get from businesses as they're shutting down or moving out of a warehouse or what have you. And that is, there are many, many good reasons why a business might hesitate to get on the phone to us. You know, intellectual property, trade secrets, privacy, ongoing litigation. You know, there are a range of reasons why businesses might think that the more prudent decision is basically to let the records go. So that's an issue that we have to manage. Part of addressing the issue is reaching out to businesses, developing relationships with business leaders, with business organizations, trying to increase that level of trust so that, odds are, when that time comes, we get that call inviting us to have a look at these interesting records that sit in warehouse or building A, B, or C. The fourth point, the digital record, no archival record. No, with examples of Dominion Bridge and Orica, we're talking about textual records, we're talking about maps, drawings, plans, what have you. We're talking about records on fairly robust supports that could sit in a warehouse for literally 30 years and still be in relatively good shape. A business today shuts down. Its record is a digital record. Those records, they're gone very, very, very quickly. So there's a real challenge there in equipping archives to basically acquire the digital record. Equipping archives to advise businesses and individuals appropriately, equipping archives to be in a position to help or to rescue digital records come that time. And I think that's a tremendous challenge for archives. I've heard in the archival community for the last 10 or 15 years observations like, there'll be a bit of a historical black hole around the early years of digital business, and we just have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that there will be a little bit of an archival black hole from the 1980s up to the present, and it's a concern. It's very much a concern. How to deal with the situation? These 4 points that I've just walked through, I think it's through organizations like yours that work to develop networks, to develop exchanges, to bring people into contact with each other. I think it's of tremendous benefit in ensuring that within our means, as best we can, sort of the records of business, of contemporary business, survive down the road. That's it for me. Thank you very much. I'm more than happy to take your questions if you have any.